Now, one might say, oh, okay, so what's the big deal? They have these conferences and they issue these reports. It's just a bunch of, idealistic do-gooders, issuing, blowing smoke, issuing these emotive reports. However, they have very concrete and significant effects for both the Israeli government, but also Western governments in general. The other aspect of the campaigns are to bolster the BDS movement. So we'll see civil lawsuits against corporations doing business with Israel, as well as civil lawsuits against other government officials. And Al-Haq is the primary perpetrator of these cases, although the Center for Constitutional Rights in the U.S. and PCHR are also actively involved in these cases, as well as the Israeli attorney Michael Sfard, who you may have heard of, who is the legal advisor for Peace Now, Yesh Din, and Breaking the Silence. And then we have NGO abuse of universal jurisdiction. Now, universal jurisdiction allows courts to rule on cases even though the parties and events at issue are wholly foreign. So, for instance, the court in Spain can rule on what happened, under these laws, could rule on what happened in Gaza, even though there are no Spanish victims involved, the perpetrators were not Spanish, nothing occurred on Spanish soil, and no Spanish nationals were implicated in any of the events. Now, and I'll add just as a side note that in Spain it's illegal to investigate Franco, the events surrounding Franco. So it's quite ironic that Spanish courts can investigate what's happening in Gaza, yet they're unable to investigate the crimes of Franco. And there's also many cases against companies or governments doing business with Israel to bolster the BDS movement. Now, to date, all of these cases have been unsuccessful. They've all been dismissed. Many of the cases have had numerous appeals and gone up to the Supreme Court in Spain, in the UK, in Canada, and those courts have all found that the cases are without merit. But the objective here is for the PR and for the associative impact to have Israel associated with war crimes. And eventually they hope that in the future they will have some success. It's harder to go after the US or other NATO countries, and that once it becomes acceptable to do it against Israel, it will make it much easier to start targeting other Western countries. And I think if people see it in that context of asymmetrical war. Now, I authored a study a couple years ago on these types of cases, and in a couple weeks I'm issuing an updated version, which I have a proof here. And what I found when I was doing some research to update my work was that in 2005, the EU gave a grant to PCHR surreptitiously. It gave 300,000 euro to Oxfam Novib, who then channeled that money to PCHR. And what did PCHR do with that money? They held strategy conferences around Europe, in Cairo, in London, in Spain. They had all their lawyers together, and luckily for me, PCHR had issued a report where they describe in great detail what they did. So they held these strategy conferences and basically put their cases together, which they then subsequently filed. Now, the interesting thing is if you look in the EU databases, there's no mention that PCHR got this money. And what's also interesting is this money was given under the auspices of a EU program against the death penalty. And the other interesting fact, and notice that NATO lately has been engaging in quite a few executions via targeted killings, and no money was, let's say, given to the, to a British NGO to investigate British extrajudicial executions. As I mentioned, the ultimate prize for these organizations would be to have Israelis tried at The Hague. Now, they got a little closer to their goal last year because the Palestinian Authority in January of 2009 filed a declaration at the International Criminal Court purporting to accept the jurisdiction of the court so that the court could open investigations against Israelis. Now, this was highly improper or unusual because the statute for the court only allows states to do such a thing, and at the moment the PA is not a recognized state. And then just to wrap up, other forms of NGO lawfare are not just targeting Israel officials, but they've also targeted private charities and Jewish groups for being collaborators with the Zionist regime. They file libel suits. We've had 2 libel suits filed against us by NGOs who tried to block us releasing our research about them. Luckily, they've been dismissed, those cases. And also there have been attempts to take away charitable status of Jewish organizations. So in Canada, you had Magen David Adom actually had their status taken away for a while. I think it got it back, but this is a deliberate strategy of these organizations as well.